Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for the Innovations in International Philanthropy Symposium. This is a thematic cluster discussion on Indigenous peoples. My name is Lourdes Inga. I'm Quechua descent from Peru, and I'm the Executive Director of International Funders for Indigenous Peoples, known as IFIP. I joined today from the ancestral territory of the Maidu people here in the border of the Sierra foothills of Northern California. For those of you that don't know IFIP, IFIP is the only global funder community dedicated to Indigenous peoples worldwide. Our members are US and non-US foundations and funders. As an organization, our objective is to educate and expand the sphere of influence among funders to promote thought collaboration between Indigenous peoples and the philanthropic community. IFIP transformed the philanthropic community to one that is inclusive of Indigenous peoples' worldviews and leadership. Because of the immense gap that continues to persist in the philanthropic funding going to Indigenous peoples organizations, we know, for instance, based on the last philanthropic trend between 4 years of 2011 and 2015, that only 1.2% was identified as going or benefiting Indigenous peoples. That is funding coming from US foundations going internationally. When we take a closer look at what that 1.2% entails, we can tell that a much lesser percentage goes to Indigenous-led organizations. For this reason, IFIP advocates for direct access and greater funding resources going to Indigenous-led organizations and Indigenous-led funds. Now, as you are learning, entering, or deepening your funding to Indigenous peoples, I just want to share a little more information about who are Indigenous peoples. We are located and live in all social, cultural, geographic regions of the world. And we represent 476 million, or 6.2% of the world's population. We also manage and steward about 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity and represent most of the cultural and language diversity in the world. Now, over the last 3 years, IFIP has been really amplifying the work that we're doing in the philanthropic and funding community to amplify and raise visibility of the leadership of Indigenous peoples. Among this work has also been a prioritization and collaboration with Indigenous-led funds. Indigenous-led funds are grant-making organizations or are Indigenous-led organizations that have a giving arm by which they are doing their grant-making. And they stand apart from other forms of funding because Indigenous-led funds move from immediate needs, from funding immediate needs and short-term based considerations to long-term culturally appropriate initiative that support and respect Indigenous world's views and concepts of development. Now, this year, IFIP published for the first time and first of its kind a report on the Indigenous ways of giving and sharing an Indigenous-led funds landscape analysis, which we can share during the live portion of this discussion. Now, I'm very excited that we have today two incredible Indigenous women have been long-term activists and leaders in this field, both in the Indigenous movement field, but also in the Indigenous philanthropy community. Both also are IFIP members, I'm proud to say that, and they are here representing Indigenous-led funds. In the short time that we have together for this part of the conversation, I would like to first ask Myrna Cunningham, who is chair of the steering committee of the Pawanka Fund, to first just talk a little bit about the Pawanka Fund, but also as we have all been experiencing last year, the uncertainty with COVID and the calls for justice that we see not only in the US, but all around the world. Myrna, if you can share with us, what is the role that Indigenous-led funds play in responding for the calls for justice, equity, and self-determination?
Thank you, Lourdes. Greetings from the Miskito Nation, my nation here in Nicaragua. I'm very happy to be with you today and share Pawanka Fund. This is a global Indigenous-led fund that responds to the needs of Indigenous peoples based on relationship of trust, networking, and articulation between local and global processes. That's the vision of Pawanka Fund. And what's our mission? We really, our purpose is to strengthen Indigenous people's self-determined development through effective and strategic grant making, revitalizing traditional knowledge and learning systems, management, investment at scale, and advocacy to promote intercultural philanthropy that transform power relations and ancestral and spiritual values and practices of relationship between all beings. So what our goal is to provide grants, investment, and to advocate intercultural philanthropy. And we have 6 years since we have been grant making. We have 300 Indigenous organizations that are partnered with us in the 7 sociocultural regions in more than 50 countries. And we have long-term relation with some of these organizations. So what did we do during COVID? Our grant making during the first years was based on cycles, 2 times a year. But when COVID began to hit the communities very hard, we saw and we received a lot of demands from the local communities to support the work that they were already doing to face COVID. So we created an emergency grant fund, and we supported more than 60 organizations. And what we learned through COVID is that it would have been impossible to support emergency activities in communities if we did not have that network with regional Indigenous organizations. They are the ones that made it possible to make the grant reach communities in less than 15 days. It was also, we also learned that the grants, if small grants, they did not have to be big grants, they just complement what Indigenous organizations were already doing. The work that Indigenous women were doing on traditional medicine, the work that the youth were already doing to secure food in their communities, the work that the members of the community were doing to close the communities and apply their own safeguarding protocols. So these are some of the things that we learned during COVID pandemic.
Thank you, Myrna, for sharing what the Pawanka Fund, how it worked, and the way in which it responded to the calls from Indigenous communities. I'd like to invite now Galina Agarova, who is Executive Director of Cultural Survival. And Cultural Survival also has a grant giving arm, which is the Keepers of the Earth Fund. Galina, I think Myrna touched on this briefly, but we know that Indigenous peoples have been significantly impacted by COVID. Your organization has been also responding in various ways to the request, but also to support the different initiatives of the Indigenous communities. In your experience, and to share with our audience, what does equitable recovery look like to Indigenous peoples, and how are the Indigenous-led organizations organizing towards this end?
That's a greeting in my native language. I belong to the Inuit nation of the Buryat peoples in Siberia, and that greeting just greeting my friends in my native language. And I'm also speaking from the lands and territories of the Ohlone people today, which is now known as the San Francisco Bay Area. And I would love to start my response addressing the second part of the question, how are Indigenous-led organizations organizing toward equitable recovery. And for the most part, I want to speak to my experience, to the experience of my organization and the team I work with. I know that many Indigenous-led organizations have gone above and beyond to mobilize resources and made some impossible things possible, like Pawanka Fund. As much as the world is working towards the recovery during and after the pandemic through vaccination and allocation of financial resources, what we see that Indigenous peoples, especially outside of the United States, are largely being left out of these efforts. From the beginning of the pandemic, in March 2020, Cultural Survival has been deploying and channeling these resources to Indigenous communities. In addition to providing our regular programming, we pivoted to swiftly adapt to the needs of the communities on the ground. Our partners, leaders, Indigenous leaders, community organizers, chiefs have been contacting us and informing us about the grave situations on the ground, the pre-existing conditions, the systemic discrimination, inequalities, lack of access to culturally appropriate information, holistic medical care, food, water, and so on, has been exacerbated by the pandemic. And many Indigenous communities have suffered much higher rates of infection, much higher rates of deaths. And I have to say that in my own organization, where we employ most of our staff from the communities where we serve, they reflect the realities on the ground. And we, as a team, have experienced the illness ourselves and had deaths among our family members. So this is the conditions that our Indigenous-led organizations are working in. We have also noticed tremendous needs on the ground. For example, we've received over 800 requests for support during our last round of grants applications. As an organization that both fundraises and then channels the resources to the ground around the globe, we have to raise every single dollar, and hasn't been easy. And that's due to the fact that Indigenous peoples are not a priority for many foundations' portfolios. And in my mind, that needs to change. Since March of last year, we have really worked hard to bring these resources. In 2020, we've distributed 30 grants to communities for our Keepers of the Earth Fund, and also supported 21 radio stations through our Community Media Fund. And this year, we're just finalizing our second round of grants, and the results will be ready in about a week. Additionally, this month we have incredible news. MacArthur Foundation has allocated $900,000 to support Cultural Survival to distribute these resources to communities. And we will be distributing these resources in the United States and India, in Nigeria and Mexico. So I just wanted to give a response to the first part of the question: what does equitable recovery looks like from our perspective? And I think the first thing is that focusing both on the immediate needs, but also on long-term solutions, as you've mentioned, Lourdes. We're not thinking just about what's needed today, what's needed now. We're thinking about what's beyond the pandemic and what's going to strengthen Indigenous communities long-term, and hence the focus on traditional medicine, on food sovereignty, access to water and sanitation. Secondly, supporting Indigenous-led organizations with the long history and experience working with Indigenous communities, not only in the United States, but outside of the United States, with staff that have on the ground, hands-on experience in the communities that they serve. Third, large unrestricted grants that allow Indigenous-led funds to do their self-determined work according to their values and principles and the needs of the communities. And finally, supporting Indigenous-led funds with large endowments, which is the ultimate expression of trust and devolution of decision-making to Indigenous leaders, to Indigenous-led funds.
Thank you, Galina, for that. I think both of you have touched on a really critical and important points when it comes to supporting and working alongside, but also understanding the communities and the players and the cultural context of funding and supporting Indigenous peoples, particularly their priorities and as well as self-determination. Now, as our audience might be wanting to hear, I would like to invite you both to perhaps in closing, share with us. I myself have been in philanthropy for a while, I think over 20 years now, and both of you have been around philanthropy for a long time, and we've seen the changes that we have gone through, first social change to social justice to thinking about how do you support participatory grant making, to thinking about now how do you support certainly areas of DEI and equity and trust-based philanthropy. But in the context of Indigenous philanthropy, what would be the message that you want to leave with this and share with the audience? And what does the philanthropic community need to do to go beyond expressing solidarity to Indigenous peoples to actually, having a visible commitment and action that we can see? And Myrna, if you want to start, yes, go ahead.
Sure, I can go first. I think philanthropy has to understand the way in which we see philanthropy. And I would say we believe that our communities have been doing philanthropy historically, traditionally. We have a culture of sharing, of giving. In a community, everybody share what they have with the rest. So what we see philanthropy as that partner that can share with us, but that building of that partnership means that they have to understand that we have our own systems. And we use maybe terms like self-determination. We use terms that maybe it's very difficult to understand. But what we are saying is, let's join hands together to solve the problems of humanity. We from Pawanka Fund, what we understand is that if we support revitalization of traditional knowledge system, communities are regaining their dignity. We are recognizing their knowledge system. We are recognizing their culture, their language, their spirituality. We are recognizing that they know what are their economical institutions, their customary law institutions. And these knowledge systems can really influence the rest of the communities to gain equity, equality, racial, and that is the way in which we face racial justice, bringing these communities that are giving so much to the world. You mentioned at the beginning, 80% of biodiversity is being protected by our communities. If we do not change the way in which we are doing this kind of work, these communities are going to disappear. Who will protect the biodiversity for the rest of the world? So we are not here saying we are promoting our communities just for our communities to continue living. Of course, that is important, but we are doing it because we know we can contribute to change the way in which the world is facing a lot of the crises like climate change, like hunger, like all of the racial injustice, all of these problems that all of us are facing. So philanthropy can contribute a lot if we begin to join hands together and we continue revitalizing, empowering these communities so we can all build the changes together.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. Galina?
Oh, thank you, Myrna. A lot has already been said, but I just wanted to complement this by sharing what philanthropy means to me personally as an Indigenous woman who was born and raised in a community. There is no such a word as philanthropy in my native language, and I believe there's not such a word in many, if not all, Indigenous languages. But what exists in our understanding is abundance, sharing, gratitude, exchange, like Myrna has mentioned, relationships. When my grandmother had an excess of milk and sour cream, she would always share it out to other families. And in return, we would get berries, meat, eggs, and other produce. And at any given time, every family had enough of everything. And that's what philanthropy has always meant for me. Just a week ago, I was in Oregon visiting with my family, and one of the things was picking berries, that we were picking berries every day during our stay in Oregon. And the lush forests of the Pacific Northwest are so rich. And I counted 7 kinds of berries when I was roaming in the forest and trying all these berries. And I was telling my mom about how I encountered, how I picked strawberries, blackberries, black currants, thimbleberries, huckleberries. And I could see how my mother was receiving that energy of abundance as I was telling those stories. No, I didn't pick every berry in the forest, right? It's not in our tradition, Indigenous ways of living. But I filled my heart with spiritual abundance, that I was able to pass it back to my mother as she was listening to that story. How is it relevant to this conversation on philanthropy here? As I mentioned earlier, philanthropy to me equates to abundance. And I also understand that these scarcity mindsets are very prevalent in the field. Let's be honest. And it presents itself in the language, in some behaviors, such as lack of trust, excessive questioning and due diligence, and gatekeeping. Some of the actions to counteract this, I think, in my mind, come from Indigenous perspectives. And these are building genuine relationships and trust with your partners, approaching with humility, understanding maybe we're not the smartest people in the room, right? Also trusting and understanding the brilliance of Indigenous peoples that is supported by millennia-old knowledge, traditional knowledge, and understanding of the relationship with the natural environment, with the lands that they live on. Supporting Indigenous life forms with unrestricted general support grants, multi-year support grants, that against all odds and challenging are still functioning and channeling these resources to the organizations, to the communities, to the activists, and really providing with all the support that they need, including technical support, financial support, for their self-determined future. And these are the visible actions that we would like to suggest to pursue if we want to support Indigenous peoples in general. That's it.
Thank you, Myrna, and thank you, Galina, for joining me in this conversation. I think there is always much more that we can share, and we look forward to the live portion of this conversation to be in dialogue with all of you who will be in the audience. I want to express my gratitude to the New England International donors and also to the Philanthropic Initiative for inviting us to be part of this important symposium. And particularly in the context of innovations in international philanthropy, I think, I hope to see you all at the thematic discussion, because Indigenous peoples have been doing and innovating for millennia. So thank you again, and I will see you in the live portion.
Thank you.
Thank you.